say a few words to us. Let's see what they want.
Is the Zoom thing working? Because Patty's mom is on Zoom and I'd love for her to.
Yeah, it is working.
Great.
You hear us okay?
Hello, Ava. Hi. First thing is, I'm just totally overwhelmed. I mean, I don't know how I want to say this. I do want to say, first of all, I want to thank Jonathan and Ted and Jill and Dean for arranging this whole thing. I think it started with just a little idea, with the idea of it being about Rutgers, really, and it kind of grew into this great up-here science conference. And I think actually, like, from my point of view, if someone told me that there was going to be a philosophy of science conference with this program, I would immediately go to hear. Of course, some of the speakers are my friends in New York. I don't have to go very far. I see them all the time, but it's amazing bunch of people, to say nothing of all the other people who've come here. Some are students, some are colleagues, some are from way in the past. Just, I'm overwhelmed. I wanted to supposed to be very thankful for everybody to come and to do this. I'm really glad to see it. What I wanted to talk about is what it was like being a philosopher in a way. I got interested in philosophy because I got interested in some particular issue. Well, I was actually taking courses in the Republic was part of it, and I thought that was fascinating, but I really didn't think I really know quite what's going on. I was taking some courses in which probability came up, and I got very interested in trying to figure out what probability is. So I got sent to philosopher of science and ended up going into philosophy. Not that I will go about that. But when I look back at a career, I just feel as if there must be like I don't believe in these things, but like an angel who has been taking care of me all this time. Because although I bounced around a bit, I've gotten to meet like the most interesting people in philosophy, and not necessarily philosophy, that like sort of philosophy, and other people are interested in it. And colleagues at Rutgers have been incredible. When I first came to Rutgers, the reason I got to Rutgers was because Peter Klein, who's in New Brunswick now but can't come here for various reasons, but I will see him. He and Ernie and Brian decided to make a really great department. And so they hired people like Tim and Jerry Fodor and a bunch of other people I didn't go to mentioning, but it was just fantastic place. And I got hired because I knew Jerry, part and I knew Ernie and Brian. They got me here too. So just piece of pure luck that I ended up here. And I was graduate director at the beginning and just had amazing graduates, some of whom are here now, who were there at the beginning. It was such a lucky place. And because of being a philosopher, not only did I have great students, but I ended up with a wonderful wife. And a kid who is here someplace. I'm not going to say too much, I don't want to embarrass him, but he announced to us that he would never study philosophy, but every one of his papers reads like a philosophy paper. And I just wanted to tell one story of many stories. I don't know if there's going to be time later.
There will be time later.
Okay. I would say this now. When I think about being at Rutgers at the very beginning, what really comes to mind is there was a person who's on the faculty here. I probably only a few of us could remember her. It's Renee Weber. Some of you remember her.
Yeah.
So I didn't know her very well, but she knew, for whatever reason, she like knew. She just took Buddhist philosophy. She knew a lot of important physicists. She knew John Bell and Roger Penrose, David Bohm. And my most vivid memory, can I tell a story too? About early Rutgers.
If I say no at the end, what do we do?
Stick Milo on me. Is Roger Penrose came here to give a talk, and there's this chapel thing.
Yeah.
I don't even know what Penrose said, but whatever he said, Tim did his usual Tim thing, and I remember him up in the balcony. So it's such a great memory, thanks somebody to Penrose from there. And when Renee invited us all to dinner, when David Bohm was here, so I think Shelley was at that dinner too, right?
I think so.
It was a fantastic event, it was a long time ago, but you can imagine that, because I somehow bubbled into philosophy, I got to meet David Bohm. Incredible, and so Bohm was at this dinner, and we started asking him, he's famous for coming up with a way of thinking about quantum mechanics, which looks like, not here to lecture about it, but anyway, it's a very interesting idea. And it looked like it's something that Einstein would have liked. And I remember we were asking him about Einstein. This is my memory. You might tell me I'm making it up when I tell you, Chris, about asking him why Einstein really didn't just say that you got it right. This is right. This is what I wanted all along. And he got sort of very shaky and nervous about it. And his wife took him out of the room. Is that what you remember? Yeah. I mean, so I'm just telling you this so people understand how I feel about having a career in philosophy. Just saying nothing of knowing Jerry Fodor. I will not say much about that, but he was an oversized presence in this department for years. And among my fondest memories is coming into Rutgers on the bus with him explaining operas and literature. And it's just so I'm going to stop.
There will be times, you will have many opportunities to share your story.
John got to hear a lot of my stuff, but David is gonna talk now, and of course, well, I won't say anymore.
Thank you, Barry.
So we have. David Albert on why David Albert, am confused about the probabilities of self-location. Michael Stravins will be chairing the session, so you can run it for 10 minutes later than Joe.
Okay. I'm going to give a real philosophy talk in a minute, but I wanted to begin, especially since it's the first talk at the conference, with a couple of words about Barry. Those of you who were at the event at Johns Hopkins a couple of years ago, celebrating the publication of Barry's book, heard this little spiel before, but it comes very much from the heart, and so I wanted to say it again. Like I said, I want to say something about Barry himself, and I want to do that by saying something about the role that he has played in my own life. I do this not in order, or not entirely in order, to bring myself into the center of these proceedings, but because I suspect that the role that Barry played in my life is in many ways paradigmatic of the role he's played in the lives of lots of other people in this room, and of many other people besides, who for one reason or another aren't able to be here with us today. 40 years ago, when I was a new assistant professor of physics at the University of South Carolina, Barry turned up in my office and asked me to talk to him about quantum mechanics. And we liked each other right away, and a lot. We understood each other. We spoke the same language. Both of us were displaced leftist Jewish New Yorkers, and both of us were in one way or another creatures of the labor movement and of the aftermath of the Holocaust and of the McCarthy period and of everything that happened in the 1960s. And both of us were old enough to be able to remember that there had been moments when people were hopeful about the possibility of a profoundly better world. And both of us got the same jokes, and both of us turned out to be susceptible under similar circumstances, and particularly in one another's company, to inconvenient and uncontrollable fits of giggling. And although I've never been able to stand or to condone or to forgive Barry's puns, I've nevertheless, over the years, somehow come to need them and to await them and to depend on them. And I found that if I talked to Barry about physics, and if I kept buying him beers, he would talk to me about philosophy. And it was Barry who revealed to me in those early conversations that I simply had no idea what I was talking about when I talked, as I did all the time and as I had all my life, about things like laws and chances and causes and counterfactuals and explanations and reason and logic and God knows what else. And he had this way of talking that was sober and clear and open and straight and honest and curious and generous and friendly, and which had absolutely nothing to do with ego or with combat or with rank. And as if it was the most fun it was possible to have, with all your clothes on and with all your wits about you, was talking things through. And getting things a little bit straighter and clearer in your head. And I don't think I'd ever met anybody quite like that before, and I had certainly not met anybody quite like that in academia before, and it made a big impression on me. And the long and the short of it is that I put myself to school with him, and that he's been talking to me ever since, and that he's taught me most of what I've ever managed to learn about philosophy. And it's only because of him that it ever occurred to me that I might try to write a book. And it's only because of him that it ever occurred to me that I might try to earn a living by teaching philosophy. And he's played a pivotal role in every piece of philosophical work that I've been involved in. Anyway, at a certain point, I think it was in 1986, Barry decided that it was time for me to apply to jobs in the philosophy department. And I sent out some applications, and I was being considered, among other places, at Berkeley. And shortly after I'd gone out there to give a job talk, Barry got a call from John Searle. Searle seemed to have liked my talk, but he was understandably concerned about my lack of any formal academic background in philosophy. And he was pressing Barry about that, and he finally said, "So what's the deal with this guy? He has a degree from the Barry Lower Institute of Philosophy." And Barry, so he tells me, replied, "You have a problem." And I take it that on reflection, Searle concluded that he did not, in fact, have a problem with that, and I got the offer. And I felt at the time, and I felt ever since, that a degree from the Barry Lower Institute of Philosophy is damn well good enough for me. And maybe it's worth telling one more story in a similar vein at this juncture. Some of you may not be aware that Mark Lang, who's here today, is Barry's cousin. And once upon a time, I imagine this must have been 30 years or so ago, Barry got a call from Mark's mother. Mark had apparently just told his parents that he intended to study philosophy, and his mother was calling Barry to plead with Barry to dissuade him. And Barry was assuring her that this certainly had nothing to do with him, and that he and Mark weren't even particularly close, and that Mark's decision was news to him, and that there was certainly nothing that he was in a position to do about it. And Mark's mother was apparently not inclined to believe this and was sure that something more nefarious was afoot. And the conversation went around in circles for a while, and finally Mark's mother was simply at the end of her patience, and she felt that the course of her son's very life and happiness was hanging in the balance. And she saw that she was going to have no alternative but to be brutally and absolutely frank. And she said something to the effect of, "How can you treat this matter with such horrifying indifference? Do you care nothing at all what's to become of this child? Do you want him to end up like you?" And I've always liked to imagine that what Mark felt at the time and what he's felt ever since is that that was damn well good enough for him. And let me just mention one more thing before I stop talking in this vein. And this point is maybe the most personal and the most important. Barry has been so absolutely steadfast and so absolutely unwavering for 4 years in promising me, in lying to me, whenever I've made an idiot of myself, and however often I've made an idiot of myself, and however badly I've made an idiot of myself, that it's not true, and it doesn't matter, and those other people are just silly, or just jealous, or just mean, and that no matter what anybody says, I'm the cleverest and most adorable little Jewish investigator of physics in the whole world. And I know that I can call him and hear that whenever I need to. And to know that I can call him and hear that whenever I need to has been one of the great comforts and one of the great
After a
compensations.
story like that, I'm not sure you're ever gonna hear it again.
And one of the great consolations for the catastrophe of ever having been born. And for that, and for everything, I love him very, very much. Good. Is this mine? I don't know. The title of my talk is Why I'm Confused About Probabilities of Self-Location. My aims, as the title should make clear, are modest. I want to share some long-standing puzzlements about self-locating probabilities, which no amount of reading or listening or pondering have thus far managed to cure. This stuff seems to come easily, thank you, and intuitively to lots of people, but it hasn't come that way to me. And all I want to do here is to point as clearly and as straightforwardly as I can to some of the places where I get stuck. Let me start by reminding you, just by way of setting the stage, of the more familiar and more traditional and more straightforward variety of probability that we're used to running into in physics. The familiar objective probabilities of physics are connected to frequencies. The precise nature of this connection is, of course, an ancient and fraught philosophical topic, but nobody doubts that some such connection exists, and nobody doubts that the connection is absolutely essential to our understanding of what those sorts of probability claims mean, and how they can be confirmed and disconfirmed, and of how they function in explanation. Here's how things work, for example, in the case of the GRW theory of the collapse of the quantum mechanical wave function, a theory in which the fundamental laws of the time evolution of the world are explicitly stochastic. Suppose that a certain isolated physical system, S, is at present in a certain quantum mechanical microstate, psi. The GRW theory assigns some definite numerical probability to the proposition that, say, the measurement of a certain quantum mechanical observable O carried out on S, X seconds from now, will yield the result O equals 17. And we associate that probability with a stable relative frequency with which measurements of O carried out on systems X seconds after those systems have been prepared in the state psi, yield the result O equals 17. And we're used to taking it for granted that one can straightforwardly measure this probability by preparing a sufficiently large collection of systems in the state psi and carrying out a measurement of O on each of them X seconds later. You simply count how many of those O measurements yield the result O equals 17 and divide that number by the total number of O measurements in question and write that quotient down in your laboratory notebook, and you're done. And it'll help for the discussion that follows to bear the following perfectly obvious and perfectly straightforward features of this particular example. And I think the same applies to the probabilities in statistical mechanics and so on, to bear the following features of this example in mind. One, the connection between what you might call the probabilistic setup on the one hand, and the numerical value of the associated objective physical probability on the other, is a substantive claim about how the world is. It is in particular a matter of physical law, or of something very closely akin to physical law, and not a matter of mere logic or meaning. So, for example, in the case of the GRW theory, what I'm calling the probabilistic setup is some proposition, call it P psi T, of the form system S is in microstate psi at time T. And all I need to point out here is that the connection between this proposition and a proposition like the physical probability that a measurement of some observable O on S carried out at time t plus x will yield the result O equals 17 is such and such is a matter of law and not a matter of mere logic and not a matter of mere meaning. It's a substantive claim about how the world is and not something that can be deduced by means of an analysis of the definitions of the terms involved. Second point, it's essential to our notion of objective physical probabilities that we can measure them to any accuracy we like, to any level of confidence we like, by means of the sorts of experiments with large ensembles that I discussed above. Three, it's essential to our notion of objective physical probabilities that they're fit to play a central role in explaining the stable long-run frequencies that we actually encounter in the world. And it's essential to the explanatory relationship between those probabilities and those frequencies that the probabilities themselves are measurable, as discussed in the previous point, and that they're contingent and law-like features of the world, as discussed in the first point. And it'll be worth bearing in mind in this connection that much of the contemporary excitement about self-locating probabilities in and around the foundations of quantum mechanics has to do with the thought or the hope that probabilities like that might somehow be fit to play a central role in explaining the frequencies of outcomes of measurements on quantum mechanical systems. Indeed, the thought or the hope is that self-locating probabilities might be fit to play exactly the same role in Everettian pictures of quantum mechanics as the objective physical probabilities in the GRW theory play in pictures of quantum mechanics that involve a collapse of the wave function. And not only with respect to explanation, but with respect to measurement and prediction and confirmation as well. And it is this thought or this hope that was originally at the back of my own interest in self-locating probability. And it's this thought or this hope to which my remarks here are primarily and in the first instance addressed. It's essential to our notion, fourth point, it's essential to our notion of objective physical probabilities that there's some give or some looseness or some tolerance in the connection between those probabilities and their associated relative frequencies. That is, it's essential to our notion of what it is that we're asserting when we assert that the objective physical probability that a certain coin lands heads is 0.5, that assertion is compatible with the proposition that the actual relative frequency of heads in any particular finite sequence of flips is something other than 0.5. Indeed, the proposition that the objective physical probability that a certain coin lands heads is 0.5 turns out to entail, among other things, that the objective physical probability that the relative frequency of heads in any particular sufficiently long sequence of flips will be exactly 0.5 is in fact exceedingly low. Fifth point, it hardly needs saying, but I'll say it nevertheless, that in light of points 1 and 4, there's no strictly logical or analytic connection between any given probabilistic setup and the actual worldly relative frequencies that are associated with objective physical probabilities that are associated with that probabilistic setup. You might say that there doubly fails to be a connection like that. In the first place, and this was the content of my first point, there's no strictly logical or analytic connection between the probabilistic setup and the objective physical probability. And in the second place, and this is the content of the fourth point about the looseness, there's no strictly logical or analytic connection between the objective physical probability and the actual worldly relative frequency. The connection in question here, remember, has to have some give or looseness or tolerance. Good. With all that in mind, let's turn to our subject here, which is probabilities of self-location. As I mentioned above, what I have in the back of my mind in this discussion, and what I'd like you to have at the back of yours, is the possibility of applying the machinery of self-locating probabilities to various open questions in physics, and in particular to Everettian pictures of quantum mechanics. But I'm mostly going to limit myself here, for the sake of brevity and clarity, to the simplest and purest and least controversial case of self-location that I can think of. And my thought is that whatever problems arise for such probabilities in this simple and uncontroversial case will arise in the Everettian case, and in the cosmological case, and in the Boltzmann brane case, and in any number of other particular cases of interest to physics as well. Good. So here's the problem I want to consider. Suppose Captain Kirk is beaming down to the surface of a planet. He knows in advance that the transporter is malfunctioning in the following way. To begin with, when Kirk steps into the transporter and presses the button, N Kirks, not just one, appear on the surface of the planet, all with their eyes closed. Moreover, various characteristics, A, B, C, which the Kirks themselves will only be able to see once their eyes are open, are distributed among these Kirks in certain fixed and definite proportions. Proportions which are part and parcel of the particular kind of malfunction which is now affecting the transporter, and of which Kirk is, again, in advance, thoroughly aware. So, for example, Kirk knows in advance that a certain proportion, A over N, of the Kirks will find when they open their eyes that they're wearing green outfits. Or perhaps Kirk knows in advance that a certain proportion, B over N, of the Kirks will find when they open their eyes that the phrase "you win" is displayed on the screen of their smartphone, or something like that. So, the probabilistic setup in this case is some indexical proposition, call it proposition sub Kirk, of the form, I am one of these N Kirks, standing on the surface of the planet with our eyes closed, all of whom remember having just now stepped into a transporter, which is malfunctioning in exactly the way described above, and press the button, and A of which are wearing green outfits. And I'm curious about the probability, given the truth of this proposition, that I am wearing a green outfit. And at this point, what happens to me is that a terrifying ocean of questions instantaneously proliferate in every imaginable direction. I don't know how to rank them. I don't know how to organize them. I don't know exactly how many there are or exactly how to distinguish one from another. What I can offer, and what I hope will at least serve to convey something of my perplexity, is a meandering conversation between myself and an imaginary amalgam of the various mavens of self-locating probability. For those of you who don't know Yiddish, maven means expert in Yiddish, but it carries a faint hint, at least in some contexts, of something more like self-proclaimed or something. Anyway, what I can offer is a meandering conversation between myself and an imaginary amalgam of the various mavens of self-locating probability who have over the years done the best they can to straighten me out. So the remainder of the talk consists of this dialogue. Myself. I'm used to being able to confirm or disconfirm theories of objective physical probability by going out and measuring the probabilities in question. So, for example, what we do in the case of the GRW theory is prepare an ensemble of identical probabilistic setups, a large ensembles of systems in the quantum state psi, or a large, and then go out and do the appropriate measurements and calculate the appropriate relative frequencies and write those frequencies down in our experimental notebooks. But it's hard to imagine how that's going to work for probabilities of self-location. Consider, before we get to probabilities and frequencies and so forth, a mere single run of the sort of self-location experiment described above. Suppose that is that proposition sub Kirk obtains and the Kirks open their eyes. And note that the evolution of the physical state of the world over the course of that single run is not going to depend in any way whatever on the color of the outfit that I find I'm wearing. Note that is that the evolution of the physical state of the world over the course of that single run is not going to depend in any way whatever on how that run comes out. And it follows, of course, that the outcome of that run cannot be recorded in any physical property of the world, and that the outcome of that run cannot be communicated to anybody else. And it goes without saying that the same sorts of things, the same sorts of worries are going to infect all the more deeply the much more elaborate business of measuring frequencies and assessing probabilities. Consider, for example, various different theories of the numerical value of the probability that given the truth of this proposition, Kirk, I'm wearing a green outfit. One theory says the probability is A over N. Another theory says it's A over 2N. A third theory says it's 0. A fourth theory says it's 1, and so on and so forth. The very idea of measuring a probability like that, the very idea that is of a physical process of which, by means of which the numerical value of that probability ends up inscribed in some more or less reliable way in some laboratory notebook, seems like nonsense. The point, once again, is that the evolution of the physical situation of the world in the sorts of circumstances we're considering here is perfectly and utterly and manifestly independent of the numerical value of that probability. And it follows that nothing whatever about the future physical situation of the world can depend on which particular one of the above mentioned theories, the probability theories, are true. And it follows in particular that nothing about what ends up getting written down in any particular laboratory notebook or what gets communicated to any particular colleague can reliably be depended on can reliably depend, on which particular one of those theories is true. Maven, I'm not sure I see what's worrying you. The probability that I'm wearing a green outfit is equal to the frequency of Kirks who are wearing green outfits among all the Kirks who, for all I know, might now be me. Thus, the probability that I'm wearing a green outfit, given the truth of propositions of Kirk, is A over N. Myself, well, okay, that's interesting, but you don't seem to be responding to my question. I'm asking you how you know that. Did you or did somebody measure that probability? Is there some frequency out there in the world associated in the appropriate way with that probability? Think again of how things go in the GRW theory. Is there some set of observable features of the world that I can just go out and count, as there are in those other cases, in order to measure the numerical value of this probability? I don't see, again, how there could be. Maven. But of course there is. The procedure is in fact precisely the same as the one you described in connection with those other cases. Prepare the probabilistic setup in question. That is, step into the malfunctioning transporter described in propositions of Kirk and press the button. Make the appropriate measurement. That is, open your eyes and see what color your outfit is. Repeat these two steps some large number K of time, and note the number J of those times that you turn out to be wearing a green outfit, and then divide J by K. That ratio is the relative frequency that's associated in the way you alluded to above with the probability in question here. The ratio is the relative frequency that one measures in order to get evidence about the value of that probability. The ratio is the relative frequency by means of which one confirms or disconfirms various different theories of that probability. Myself, but the procedure you've just described seems very importantly different from the procedure we use in the case of, say, GRW. When that latter procedure is complete, what we're left with is a single measuring agent holding a single laboratory notebook in which a single relative frequency value is recorded. When the procedure you have just described is complete, there are going to be n to the k Kirks standing around. And some of those Kirks are going to have relative frequencies of wearing a green outfit written down in their laboratory notebooks that are close to A over N. And some of those Kirks are going to have relative frequencies of wearing a green outfit written down in their laboratory notebooks that are close to A over 2n. And some of those Kirks are going to have relative frequencies of wearing a green outfit written down in their laboratory notebooks that are close to 1. And some are going to have values that are close to 0, and so on. Which one of those relative frequency values is the one that I'm supposed to attend to? Which one of those relative frequency values is the one that I'm supposed to treat as evidence for or against some particular hypothesis about the probability in question here? Maven, you're right, of course, that there will be many different Kirks standing around at the end of this procedure with many different relative frequencies written down in their laboratory notebooks. But the situation is not going to be nearly as perplexing or as disorderly as you suggest. You neglect to mention, for example, that as K grows larger and larger, a more and more overwhelming majority of these Kirks are going to have something very close to the frequency A over n written down in their laboratory notebooks. Myself, yes, I can see all that, but how exactly is that supposed to help? Maven, simple. Imagine that you're about to perform this procedure. Imagine that you're about to step into the malfunctioning transporter for the first of your K repetitions. You know that once those K repetitions are complete, there are going to be n to the K Kirks, any one of which might, for all you know, be the future you, and the overwhelming majority of which have the inscription green outfit frequency equals A over n written down in their laboratory notebooks. So the probability that you are going to have that inscription written down in your laboratory notebook is going to be overwhelmingly high. Myself, you know that once the K repetitions are done, there are going to be n to the K Kirks, any one of which might, for all you know, be the future you. But I find this utterly baffling. Insofar as I can see, the original first personal I that steps into the malfunctioning transformer is something that simply doesn't survive these repetitions, or not at any rate as a single unified consciousness. And so there seems to be no such intelligible question before I first step into the transporter as which one of the n to the K Kirks on the surface of the planet am I eventually going to be? And there seems to be no such intelligible question as what is the probability that I am eventually going to be some particular one of those Kirks? I'm not sure what the least confusing way of talking about a situation like this is. I'm not sure that is what the least confusing choice of semantic conventions for a situation like this might turn out to be. Maybe the original I should be identified with all of the Kirks that end up standing on the surface of the planet, or maybe the original I should be identified with none of the Kirks that end up standing on the surface of the planet. But I can't see any reasonable way of talking about situations like this on which questions about which particular one of those NK Kirks I am eventually going to be, or about the probability that I'm eventually going to be this Kirk as opposed to that one. I can't see how talk like that is going to make any sense. Maven, fair enough. Let me redesign the example a little. Here's the idea. Kirk wants to measure the probability that once he's standing on the surface with his eyes closed, after having stepped into the malfunctioning transporter and pressed the button, he's wearing a green outfit. He will measure it by the following procedure. He starts out wearing gray. He steps into the transporter and presses the button. Once he senses that he's reached the surface of the planet, keeping his eyes closed, he takes out his smartphone and takes a selfie. Then, with his eyes still closed, all of his clothing is removed, and he's carried back to the USS Enterprise, and he's dressed as before in a gray outfit, and he steps into the transporter again and arrives on the surface and takes another selfie, and so on. The process is repeated some large number K of times. And at the end of those K repetitions, he activates an app on his smartphone, which automatically calculates the relative frequency of green outfit selfies. Good. Now he's standing on the surface of the planet. along with the n to the k minus 1 other Kirks, the overwhelming majority of which are holding smartphones that display a relative frequency near a over n, with his eyes closed. The probability that when he opens his eyes, he'll see a relative frequency value on his smartphone that's near a over n is clearly overwhelmingly high. So it's overwhelmingly likely that his measurement of the probability that he's wearing a green outfit after having stepped into the transporter and pressed the button and felt his feet on the surface of the planet has the outcome a over n. Myself, okay, I see. But now you seem to be arguing in circles. The question at issue here, remember, is this. Given that I am one or another of some particular collection of different Kirks, a certain definite fraction of which have a certain definite property, what is the value of the probability that I have that property? And you've been trying to show me that the value of that probability is equal to the value of that fraction. And the trouble is that your demonstration turns out to take precisely that equality for granted. You say, now he's standing on the surface of the planet, along with n to the k minus 1 other Kirks, the overwhelming majority of which are holding smartphones that display a relative frequency value near a over n with their eyes closed. The probability that when he opens his eyes, he'll see a relative frequency value on his smartphone screen that's near a over n is clearly, you say, overwhelmingly high. But the transition from the first of these sentences to the second assumes that the probability of any particular one of these Kirks having some particular property is just the proportion of all the Kirks that have that property. And the trouble is that this is precisely what you're trying to show. Maven, no, this doesn't seem fair. I'm not assuming that the probability of any particular one of the Kirks having some particular property is just the proportion of all the Kirks that have that property. I'm assuming something almost infinitely weaker. What I'm assuming, and all I'm assuming, is that if the proportion of all the Kirks that have some particular property is minuscule, then the probability that any particular one of those Kirks has that property is minuscule as well. Myself, right you are, my bad, but this isn't going to help. I'm exactly as perplexed by this weaker assumption as I am by the stronger one, and in exactly the same way, and for exactly the same reasons. And that's what I was a little ineptly trying to say with my talk about circularity a minute ago. The questions are still the same. How do you know? Where am I supposed to look out there in the world for the frequencies by means of which your claims about these probabilities can be confirmed or disconfirmed, and so on? Maven, let's try another tag. I step into the transformer and I press the button and I feel myself to have arrived with my eyes closed on the surface of the planet. I know that there are now n Kirks on the surface of the planet, of which I am one, and that A of them are wearing green outfits. And suppose that I'm now offered a bet, which will cost me $1 and which will pay me n minus 1 over $8 if I turn out to be wearing a green outfit. And suppose that n minus 1 over a is greater than 1. Should I accept the bet? Myself, I have no idea. Maven, you have no idea? Myself, I have no idea. I mean, if I'm wearing a green outfit, then I should accept the bet, since in that case, I'll make money by accepting the bet. And if I'm not wearing a green outfit, then I shouldn't accept the bet, since in that case, I'll lose money by accepting the bet. And I have no idea whether I'm wearing a green outfit or not. Maven, but can't you see that if the Kirks are inclined to accept this bet, then the bookie is definitely going to win? Myself, if which Kirks are inclined to accept this bet? Maven, can't you see that if the bookie offers this bet to all of the Kirks, and if all of them accept it, then the bookie is certainly going to make money, and that the Kirks as a collective are certainly going to lose it? Myself, yes, of course I can see that. To say that, after all, is simply to repeat in slightly different language than that A over N of the Kurtz on the surface of the planet are wearing green outfits. But that yet again gets us nowhere. My interest here is not in how much money the bookie ends up with, and not in how much money the Kurtz as a collective end up with, but of course, in how much money I end up with. Remember that what we're supposed to be trying to figure out here, what you're supposed to be trying to help me understand here with all this talk of betting, is the value of the probability that I in particular are wearing a green outfit. And nothing you've said seems to me to shed any light whatever on that. Is that the police?
Ostentationy suggesting that time.
Okay, good. So I see. If I go on 5 more minutes, is that okay? Okay.
He's wearing a ring.
Let me
check
that. The big guy says yes.
Okay. Maven, then how about this? The frequency in question here, the frequency by means of which the probability that I'm wearing a green outfit manifests itself in the world, the frequency that the probability that I'm wearing a green outfit is supposed to explain, the frequency which I need to go out and measure in order to measure the probability that I'm wearing a green outfit, is the frequency with which the N Kirks on the surface of the planet, who for all I know might be me, are wearing green outfits. The frequency, in other words, is A over N, period, case closed, end of story. It's so clear, it's so simple, it's been right there under our noses, staring us in the face, poking us in the stomach all along. What else could it ever have been? What in the world is wrong with that? Myself, are you kidding me? Maven, maybe lose the sarcasm and just tell me if it's not too much trouble, what is wrong, what could be wrong with this proposal? Maven, I hardly know where to start. Let me see, let me get my bearing. Here are 2 things that are wrong with it. The first is, I would say, very nearly fatal, and the second is obviously and trivially and decisively fatal. 1, we start with the probabilistic setup proposition sub Kirk. And I take it, although you don't explicitly say so, that you're assigning a particular numerical probability value, the value A over N, to the truth of the proposition that given this setup, I'm wearing a green outfit. And you seem to be saying that the actual observable frequency associated with that numerical probability, the frequency which that probability value is supposed to explain, the frequency by means of which that probability value is supposed to be confirmed or disconfirmed, follows precisely and with certainty, and as a matter of logic, as a matter of definition, as a matter of meaning, from the proposition Kirk itself. Let me see if I can even begin to explain how odd that sounds to me. I thought, for starters, that the connection between the probabilistic setup and the numerical probability value was supposed to amount to a substantive claim about how the world contingently happens to be. I thought, that is, that the probabilistic setup was supposed to be connected to the numerical probability value by some contingent law of nature. That's how things work, say, in the GRW theory, and it was supposed to be precisely that contingency that made it at least conceivable that the probability in this case of my wearing a green outfit might be A over N or A over 2N or 0 or 1 or what have you. And I thought that the connection between the probability value and the actual measured frequency with that probability value was supposed to have some give in it, that it was supposed to be loose and tolerant. That again is how things work in the familiar cases of objective physical probability. But you seem to be suggesting that in the Kirk case, we can simply eliminate the middleman. You seem to be suggesting, that is, that the business of getting from the probabilistic setup to the actual measured frequency in the Kirk case requires no mention of probability at all. You seem to be suggesting that the business of getting from the probabilistic setup to the actual measured frequency in the Kirk case is a matter of logic, a matter of definition, a matter of meaning, and that no looseness and no tolerance and no contingency and no uncertainty and nothing whatever in the way of a substantive claim about the world ever enters the picture. I see you're getting very nervous. Okay. Okay, that's too bad. Good, I'm sorry, my bad. We're about halfway through, but I'll leave it there and maybe if there's time for questions, other of the elements of this dialogue will get raised. I tried to talk fast, but not fast enough.
Okay, well, let me see. Okay,
There's a few mavens here.
yeah, there are.
There's a lot of mavens
Okay,
here.
hands high mavens. And Isaac, why don't you start? And then Kathy, and then you two, and then.
By the way, Isaac was one of the mavens who comes up later in the dialogue. That hasn't come up yet.
So, okay, yeah, I would be really curious to hear the rest of the dialogue, but I want to talk about the circularity point.
Right.
You isolated it really well. I don't think you were at certain times ambiguous between whether the maven was justifying a posit or whether they were, for example, committed to the posit as an implication for something else for which they owed a kind of justification. And your ambiguity there, I think, mattered for the quality of your argument about circularity, which I didn't buy. Just because the maven commits to, so the maven has, so we're granting that there's some way to identify yourself over, let's be in the part of the dialectic where you grant there's some way to identify yourself over the series of measurements. You are one of the worms, I would prefer to call it, of Kirk's.
Right.
You posit as a sort of first guess a particular probability measure. You say, I think it's going to be whatever, probably about A over N.
Right.
Then I'm going to have a green shirt. Very, very clearly it's something probably that I'm going to have a green shirt, not that Kirk 17 or Kirk whatever is going to have it. Probably I'm going to have a green shirt. That's center proposition, probability A over. Okay. And then you said something like, well, but now I can kind of just rearrange the, re-ask a version of the same question, but about like the N to the K sort of trial that we just went through.
Oh, right.
And then you owe me an explanation for that trial only had a frequency of 1. And so what's going to explain that sort of that particular commitment of yours?
Wait. Which trial only had a frequency of 1? I'm sorry.
The trial where a single instance of this trial
Oh,
is
okay.
K successive measurements going through the tree. This was your circularity point.
I think go ahead.
So here's where I'm going with this. So that
Yeah.
it's true that the probability measure, I want to interpret as an objective chance measure, and maybe you don't have to, that the maven posited is going to assign a probability that is in fact very high. That the maven is one of the worms that sees green approximately.
That the Kirk is one of that I am one of
Yeah,
them.
and I am one of the.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That's true, but there's nothing circular about that. That's just a further commitment. It's coming from like product measure definitions. It's coming from how you assign a measure over an algebra of possible outcomes. That's not like they posit a measure, they get committed to a certain sort of objective probability over.
You mean they get committed by positing this? I don't
They
understand.
posit a measure to explain their specific observations.
No.
That measure
Okay,
itself
good. So you're raising your proposal that comes later on. Yeah, look, so there's a long conversation. I think yours is the most interesting proposal. That's why I save it for last. But as you and I have discussed many times, what's going to fall out of that is that the Kirk. The probability in the Kirk case or the Born rule in the quantum mechanics case is something true about a centered world rather than the world. Okay, and that seems to me, or let's put it this way. That seems to me in circumstances where there's any other way to save ourselves. GRW, Bohmian mechanics, so on and so forth, seems like a non-starter, okay? But I'm sorry I didn't have a chance to get to, you're the penultimate maven. In this dialogue,
Fair enough.
but we didn't have a chance to get anywhere near
So
you.
then it comes down to a different, you said the world. And
Right.
what my maven, what I'm gonna claim is that what people sort of condescendingly describe in literature is, there's just where you're located in the world, and then there's how the world is.
Right.
My sort of person, and maybe Janan's, who's gonna talk about later, is, no, where you're located is a way that the world is.
I didn't mean to be condescending, but I did mean to highlight the degree to which this is a departure from which we might have, from what we previously thought. And like I said, whether we need to make this departure or not is a function of what our other options are, okay? But yeah, thank you, Isaac.
Patty?
So I'm pretty sure I'm gonna make a fool of myself.
That's all right, I already did. I mean, of me.
Since I didn't quite follow the probability part of the talk, but it still strikes me that there's something that is the assumption behind the whole question is questionable to me, because you are setting up the whole issue like a question of, knowing the probability of which curve you're gonna be.
Right.
And you never said anything about what would that fact consist in.
No, I agree with you completely. I mean, I'll give myself the excuse that I didn't get all the way to the end, but no, this was the point of the talk. I don't think there's a genuine question there that I understand. Yeah, I don't think there is. I'm in dialogue with people who say there's a perfectly definite question there and it has a perfectly definite answer, okay? And what the talk is trying to explain is not primarily and in the first instance why I think their proposed answers are wrong, but why I don't even understand the question, right? I agree completely.
So that's very interesting, because you got the same view as, for example, that Parkin got to talking about personal identity. The usual way in which people who think that there is a matter of fact about that is to assume that there is a soul. So there is a question about which
route it goes to,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, Barry and I, fooled around with that 40 years ago, in the context of the many worlds interpretation.
us?
But, right,
there is really no such.
I completely agree. The title of this talk aims to be modest. I am perplexed in exactly the same way as you described yourself as being perplexed. Yes.
Okay, now apologies if I'm not recognizing people, but you're next. Oh, no, I didn't actually see you.
Oh.
I was waiting way down the back there. I didn't even have you on the list, but you're on the list now. Which one? Her.
I'm Sakshi, by the way.
Hi, Sakshi, how are you? Wow, everybody's here.
So I'm not gonna ask you a question from the perspective of a maven. I'm gonna ask you a question. This is actually a talk that I recently went at about a propensity view of chances and the issues that person had with a BSA view about chances.
Right.
I just want to confirm, are you still of the BSA variety, or is the David in the dialogue of the BSA variety?
The David, I mean, I don't think, I think I still have something like a BSA view of chances, but I'm not aware of that having entered in any crucial way into the dialogue. I'm just, all I'm assuming here are much less controversial things than say BS. That is, it seems to me a propensity theorist would be, or at least I would be surprised if they didn't agree with everything I said here. The idea is there are certain features of probability that everybody seems to agree on. That the probability of X occurring later doesn't follow from the meaning of the probabilistic setup, that it's a substantive claim about the world, either a best system kind of claim or a necessitarian law kind of claim or something like that, that there's this looseness that, you know, so it's true about me that as far as I know, although this is a little above my pay grade, I'm still loosely speaking, BSA person about probabilities. But if that entered into if that's crucial to the discussion here, I'm not aware of it, and maybe it represents a flaw in that discussion. I'm not sure.
So what got me thinking, or at least what I felt confused about, was the relationship you made between probability being a substantive claim about the world.
Right.
It seems like it should be counted as a law. It's not a matter of meaning or definition and logic.
Right.
And the contingency component of its explanatory role, that it's compatible with frequencies not satisfying whatever.
So maybe
the
contingent, maybe the word contingency was used a little confusingly here. Well, I just meant contingent to distinguish it from a priori or logically necessary, okay? Both a BSA theorist and a propensity theorist would agree in the way I was using the term, that probabilities are substantive contingent claims about the way the world is, not a priori or purely logical or true only in virtue of meaning or something like that.
So here's where I wasn't quite following the objection that you raised to the Maven.
Right.
Where this was supposed to, right? This was supposed to have a looser scope.
Right.
And I guess what I wanted to understand, based on objections I've heard from, right, this other objectivist about chance, that BSA does not have room for this looseness, that if a head comes out, you know, all tails in the history of the universe, you would just say this was not a chancy.
I agree, but
This sort of proposition is not even.
I agree, but let's suppose that, you know, the actual frequency of heads is 0.497888888, okay? And this combined with certain other features of the world, the two sides of the coin are physically symmetric insofar as we can see, blah, blah, blah. Then presumably simplicity considerations are going to get us to say in a case like that, probably the right choice is the probability is 0.5, okay? No, it's to say that I think this is kind of Lewis's big advance over what I would call naive frequentism, okay? To say that the laws, including the probabilistic laws, supervene on the actual history of the world is not to say that the probability of a coin flip coming out heads is identical to the probability of relevantly similar coin flips coming out heads throughout the history of the world. There are other considerations that come in. You want to fit this into a comprehensive physical theory of the world. There's an advantage to simplicity. Okay, simplicity is to be weighed against informativeness. So no, I think of, in a class I've been teaching, Ted and a couple of other people raised an interesting point about how this works out in the GRW theory. I won't go into that here, but the standard idea is that BSA is something that very much leaves room for it to be the case. And I think it's important. And this is an important feature of best system analyses as contrasted with what I would call a naive frequentist position. It's an important feature of those that they do leave room for slack, for looseness. That is, that according to those kinds of analyses, the following two statements are perfectly compatible. The probability that this coin lands heads is exactly 0.5. And the frequency with which coins like this landed heads throughout the history of the world is exactly 4.99973,824. Okay, those I don't think that BSA is incompatible with that. And if it were, I think that would be really bad news for BSA, and it would saddle it with all the flaws of a more naive kind of frequentist theory.
Okay, so next to Saki.
Yeah, so I was wondering, how does this deal with different examples? So the universe just began, right? And you're in front of a box. There were no laws, just that's how things begin. And then God tells you there is an outfit in the box. It's either green or say red. And then God tells you, and there are n boxes like this in the world.
Right.
And A of those boxes have a green outfit. Now, what's the probability that there's a green outfit in the box? Now, maybe there is no physical probability because there were no laws that just the initial state of the universe say. Surely there's got to be something like an epistemic probability.
I don't know what it means to say there's got to be something
Well,
like,
I
and
understand how it seems reasonable.
if somebody were to respond to that question by saying, how the hell should I know? Okay, I don't think that would be an unreasonable response. Okay, I don't, and of course, at this point in the conversation, what everybody says is, okay, but somebody's pointing a gun to your head and you have to bet, okay? And it seems to me that the appropriate response is, this is a very unfair way for you to behave. Okay? This is a very objectionable way for you to behave. And I don't know what else to say. You know, I have people who've been in classes of mine here at Rutgers know that I like to say under these circumstances, look, if I have no clue which outfit is in this box, okay? And somebody says, well, what's the probability that a green outfit is in this box? It has always seemed to me that the appropriate response is, which part of I have no clue do you not understand? Okay, I have no clue. Okay, period, end of story.
But I mean, credence quantifies how much clue you have. That's the point of credence. So if you use
I have no clue.
but
I have no clue.
an indifference principle is going to say indifference of all the possibilities. That's a plausible principle of rationality.
I don't, look, it is, first of all, I guess maybe it's useful to separate this into two questions, okay? There's one question of the form, could you blame me for saying A over N? Okay, maybe not, I don't know, maybe not, okay, maybe I wouldn't blame you, okay? The other is this thing A over N that you arrive at in the way you describe. Is that capable of functioning in explanations of what we see in the world, say in statistical mechanics or something like that? So look, I don't know whether I could blame you or not, you know, can you blame me? No, maybe I can't blame you. It's as crazy as any other choice. But is it capable of functioning in an explanation? Yeah, that I guess I have a strong intuition, a strong negative intuition about.
Okay, so Sean is next, and then let me make sure I have the list right in my head. Then you, then Jacob, then Jens, then down the back next to Beatrice, and then Heather. Okay, so obviously the list got a lot longer all of a sudden. So let's keep it moving along, Sean.
Okay, I feel like where we diverged was very early. It made some statement along the lines of, clearly everybody agrees with this, and I didn't feel like I agreed with it, about something about objective probabilities and frequencies. And I don't know whether it's helpful or not, but just psychologically, I feel like in folk uses of the word probability, we assign probabilities to things that are clearly not frequency based all the time, right? Who's gonna win the NBA championship? What is the right theory of dark matter? And we try to formalize the idea, and the easiest sort of most rigorous way to do it is when you do have frequencies. But I don't think we have to do it that way, and I think that clearly the issue is that you are sort of only counting things as real probabilities when they can be converted into frequencies. And some things are just not like that. And I think that you could think of all probabilities as being purely epistemic if you wanted to. You can't think of all probabilities as being frequencies if you wanted to. And I would be very happy to admit that things like self-locating uncertainties are just not frequencies, they're a different kind of thing. They need a different kind of approach. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but that might be.
I mean, one of the things we want these probabilities to do, say in the case of Everett, is to explain the frequencies we see, or the frequencies we take ourselves to see, or whatever the right word is there, okay? So let's leave aside other cases. In the Everettian case, it seems like there's got to be some connection with frequencies. That is, we take, if somebody asks us why we believe in quantum mechanics at all, okay, we're going to cite frequencies of outcomes of certain kinds of experiments. I take it, okay? So what we want from an account of the way probabilities work in Everett is some account that links those probabilities up with those frequencies.
Of course, sure.
So even if I were to grant probabilities don't always have to do with frequencies, surely they do in the Everettian case. And if one is saying, look, there are other kinds of probabilities, and I'm willing to grant that self-locating probabilities have nothing to do with frequencies, then it sounds like we're already screwed, because in the Everettian case, if we want to read the Everettian probabilities as probabilities of self-location, they also have to be the kinds of probabilities that connect up with frequencies in the appropriate way, right?
I'm saying that the frequency probabilities are a subset of ways of thinking about probabilities. In the Everettian case, if you were kind enough to grant the Everettian the ability to put a measure on their self-locating uncertainties, they would have expectations for what experiments would show that would line up with what we see in experiments.
Okay,
That's
and those
very
expectations are what explains,
Yeah.
somebody says, I want you to explain to me why I saw these frequencies. Okay, yeah. Much longer conversation one needs to have there, but thank you, yes.
Great, I'm gonna push on the strain that some people have been pushing on that ignores the explanation question completely and just says, are you required to have the credences that match the distribution of guys with shirts? You know, and
Right.
ask that question, you know, not just are you permitted, but are you required to?
Right,
And one thing I kind of think about this is the Maven said this in the dialogue.
yeah,
At some point, and your response was, I don't care about whether most of the guys with
Right.
shirts are gonna be right.
Right.
I care about whether I'm right.
right,
And I don't like that response.
okay,
Even though I'm sympathetic with a lot of the things you're saying.
Right.
The reason is that I think that norms around our reasoning especially probabilistic reasoning, sort of have to be seen as norms at the group level, because you're never, you know, it seems similar to the kind of response that you might hear someone saying who's like, oh, of course, I'm about to flip the coin, I want you to bet on it. And I say, well, the chance is 50-50, and we all agree it's a real chance.
right,
And you say, well, I don't care what the chance is. You know, I want to know whether the coin's going to be heads or tails.
right,
And, you know, you might give someone a long run argument, and then they might say, well, I'm going to die. And then you say, well, you know, most
Right.
people are going to succeed if you all engage in this kind of reasoning.
right,
And I think the reason that works is because norms are things that we apply to each other using peer pressure. So like the kind of
so
right measure of success is if I have peer
probabilistic
pressure, everybody in
claims,
my group, are we going to do
it
okay?
sounds like in the background here, probabilistic claims have a very different status than claims like X is going to happen.
Yeah.
Like claims like deterministic theories make. Probabilistic claims are in some sense wrongly construed as claims at all. They have a normative element. Is that the idea?
Yeah.
So I don't know, I mean. I tend to, I mean, this is just another confession of confusion, which maybe people can help me with. I was always very puzzled by, for example, Lewis's remark that all we know about chance is that we ought to align our credences with it, right? What he called the principle. I was completely flabbergasted by that statement when I read it, because it seemed to me that Lewis had said all kinds of other things we know about chance in terms of a best system kind of thing. I would have thought that this, on the contrary, is a little bit peripheral, okay? That what we really mean by chance is a certain claim about the whole history of the universe, okay? A factual claim. Then another question comes up, which I see as a dessert question or a second order question or something like that. Okay, given that the universe is this way, that the probabilities are such and such, okay? So on this way of construing Lewis would agree with a propensitist or any other views about chance, that chance claims are objective claims about the way the world is. Okay, a propensitist will say they're not claims about just the sequence of particular events, but they're claims about other stuff out there in the world about the way the world is, the laws. Okay, and construing Lewis as mostly about the best system analysis of chance, Lewis would be on board with that. Okay, it's an objective claim about the world. I guess that's the way I'm used to thinking about it. And I'm used to thinking of the question of how to set your credences or what the relation between the chances and your credences ought to be. As a kind of second order thing, there you can make all kinds of choices. Maybe you'll invoke a principle of indifference. You don't know where you are in the world or something like that. But the stakes are already lower. Okay, I was trying to think of probability in the way I thought Lewis had taught me and Barry had taught me, okay, about how to think about probability as a not less objective feature of the world than the propensitist thinks it is, or something like that. And so I'm happy to say, in setting your credences, maybe normative stuff comes in, but there's a space to talk about chances which has nothing normative about it. Okay, no more so than a propensitist does or somebody like that.
Okay, of course, one of the rules of the conference is no follow-ups, but the meta rule of the conference is Barry can do whatever he wants.
I think one quick remark. I think Lewis had the idea that probability lived in both places. Ian Hacking put it very nicely by saying that it's a Janus concept that looks at the world and looks at the mind. And so Lewis was asking, well, probably is about the world, but what is it about the world that could satisfy this condition that Lewis thought it's what he knew about chance, is that it's a rational guide to belief. He had a principle to connect the two, and you know, a long history about that. Many people know about that. So, but I think what David, I agree with what David said up to a point, but I think I would emphasize the double nature of probability that Lewis said at the beginning, and that's what makes it such a difficult thing to even account for. And what Sean and all are trying to do is to sort of find a way of thinking about probability, which is satisfies this idea of guiding degrees of belief, but fitting in with a different way of connecting up with worlds.
Okay.
So this question about like the approach one should take for picking credences. One of the things that I find very confusing about it is this question of uniqueness. I think one goal is to come up with a list of reasonable principles for rational decision making that will uniquely pick out a credence function that matches one rule, and that's something that's confused me a lot. I hear that implicit in a lot of this conversation. My question is actually, so in your debate with the Maven, there are two things you brought up. One was so what if the large majority of Kirks have, record a particular frequency on their phones? There are those that don't, and how do we argue?
I mean,
Because
it was just I think the response of the me in the dialogue was not so much so what as, isn't that just the same question?
Sure.
Okay,
But, and another one was this question that's come up a little bit in the questions about, what is the substantive sense in which the Kirk who began the experiment is any of the other Kirks?
right,
And if the Kirk who began the experiment isn't any of the Kirks, then what relationship is there? I think it's worthwhile to point out, and this is not an endorsement, but it's worthwhile to point out that in David Wallace's book, The Emergent Multiverse, he addresses both of those questions very deliberately and explicitly at the beginning of his argument.
right,
One thing he says is that he just takes it as a principle that just because you have many descendants in this sort of branching, set of copies, just because you have many of them rather than just one, that shouldn't change our relationship with them in a way that affects how much we should care about them. We should care about them. You should care just as much about the well-being of many descendants of yourself as one. And that's just a posit. He doesn't defend it. He just says that we ought to feel that way.
wait, he thinks you should care about them in proportion to their in proportion to their square amplitudes. Not the same about each of them.
I mean, ultimately, he argues that you should, as a consequence of the proof of his
Right.
one rule theory.
Right,
But he just begins by saying that just because there are many future copies of you other than one doesn't mean.
I mean, here's a, I mean, I'm not even sure how this is different from the Kirk case, but if you walk up to an amoeba, okay, that's about to split, okay, and you say, tell me, what do you think the chances are that you're gonna be the one on the left? It seems to me the amoeba's gonna say, I just don't know what the hell you're talking about.
That was actually in one of Everett's letters to Bryce DeWitt.
Is that right?
The amoeba example was originally in a letter from 50.
And how was it taken by them?
I don't know, Bryce
Right.
eventually switched from being
Right.
against Everett to pro Everett.
Right.
It was in his paper, Everett's paper. It was deleted by Wheeler.
It might, yeah. but
Ah, really?
It
Wow.
survived in one of the letters. Oh, maybe, okay, maybe I'm thinking of the.
Wow.
It might have been in a letter, might have been in a draft.
Not a nice story.
But,
Wow.
but the other thing that he takes head on is, so at a key point in Wallace's argument, he says, it's not just that the majority of Kirks, the majority of your descendants have the right frequency. All of them have the right frequencies. And to this you might say, well, what about all the maverick
Uh-huh,
Kirks, the ones who are way at the edge?
right,
And what he says in the book is, well, these have such small Hilbert space measure that to the level at which, so, in the way that the ever-ending multiverse is supposed to work, and the book is called The Emergent Multiverses, the branches are not fundamental, they're not pristine, they're not sharply defined.
Right.
They're inherently a little blurry.
Look-
But once branches get to below the coarse graining scale, they just don't exist anymore. He calls them a trick of the light. That's the exact phrase he uses.
so look, here we're talking, there are, I think, two completely distinct, interesting ways of trying to make sense of quantum mechanical chances in Everett, okay? One is this self-locating stuff that we've been talking about today. The other is the argument in Wallace's book, the so-called decision theoretic argument. Those are those are completely different arguments. I think many people who were enthusiastic about Everett accept both, the more the merrier, but they're very different arguments and they need to be responded to in very different ways.
But I'm not defending the
We should-
distinction here, but just
we
those
should keep
two-
moving.
Yeah,
Just-
okay.
So we're 10 minutes behind schedule, so we have about 7 minutes left. I have 3 people on the list, that seems doable. So that was Jens and you down the back there, no, okay, 2 people, Heather, and then we'll see what happens if there's any time whatsoever left.
Yeah, this should be quick. I'm just trying to figure out how far your anything goes attitude about rational choice goes. In particular, I want to figure out if you're at least willing to put the norm on the table that we ought to supervaluate across the possible chances for us. Here's a concrete case. Suppose your Kirk machine creates 3 Kirks, and then flips a coin for each of the Kirks to decide the outfit color. For the first, it flips a 50-50 coin. For the second, let's say a 70-30 coin. For the third, a 30-70 coin. Just the, you know, you have somewhat different biases. And then would you at least agree that it would be.
But wait, here, the coins are associated with objective
They are
chances.
objective chance, yes.
But then I don't understand. Then I don't understand how this overlaps with the discussion we were having at all.
Because I was thinking, I mean.
Because I was reacting to somebody who was asking me to adopt a credence on the basis of a principle of indifference, not on the basis of real physical chances.
How I model you in the original case that you described it, there were chances as well, except they were trivial, you know, you had, it was a deterministic, your Kirk machine was deterministic, it was determined whether the first Kirk.
No, but there aren't any physical chances of
If you want to.
me being, I may not just understand.
Okay, so let me just get to
Yeah.
the end of the question.
Yeah,
Would
yeah,
you
sorry.
Agree that it would be irrational then for you to pay $1,000 for a bet that paid you $1 if you wore a blue shirt and $0 if you wore a green shirt.
Right.
In that case, in the setup that I described, if you know, you have some.
In the setup you described, I think there would be something like that, but that's very different from the setup I described. Where there's no physical chancy process.
No non-trivial chances, sure.
Yeah, so I think I would agree with you. Can I just to inject humor into the atmosphere? You ask how far I would go, I can't resist telling a very short Sidney Morgenbesser story that he apparently once gave a final exam in this course at Columbia, sort of on the history of social and political thought. And the exam question was, people say Marx and Freud were interesting, but went too far. How far would you go? Anyway, go ahead. So look, I'm having trouble seeing the overlap between what you're asking. I think about what, if I understand the setup you're describing, it seems to me that I would say that certain credences are reasonable. Yeah.
I mean, so the overlap is just, both of your answers can be described by an account where your credal state should be described by some sort of convex set of probability measures that where the edges.
I mean, probably, like I said, when I was talking to Mike, I'm used to thinking of chance, and this doesn't dispute the way you set up your problem. I'm used to thinking of chances in a way that shares with propensity views and so on, the thought that these are objective claims about the world. Okay, then there's a further question. Once the chances are in place, what should you do with that? How should you incorporate that into your betting behavior, into your planning, blah, blah, blah. That's a sort of secondary question. But yes, suppose that I grant this seems reasonable, that where there are real chances, then you should fit your credences to them. Yeah, it sounds like in the situation you're describing, there's going to be some convex set within which your credences should fall. Sure.
Okay, Heather, and then we'll wrap up.
All right, so yeah, I'm really sympathetic to a lot of everything you said. I was just wanting to understand more about this move between like the kind of self-location and the identity question, and then dividing, and then like thinking the really important relevant thing is the process that we think is physical and that has objective chance. So you know, you can't get out of this just by saying, well, like, what if I posit primitive identity facts or whatever? Because you could just say,
Yeah.
Suppose there's you and like 5 other guys, and they're gonna be on planets with green and blue shirts. Because as soon as you might wonder like, what are the chances? And you think, well, tell me more about the process. And I feel like the duplicator is kind of,
you forget that that's a question you should be asking, because you wanna know what's the mechanism by which.
No, I
it is-
agree. I mean, and actually, that's why the way I set up the problem was, it was one of the mavens who pushed it back to what happens during the splitting. If you remember, the way I set up the problem is, given that I'm already on the surface, and I know that I'm one of these Kirks, so there isn't going to be any more splitting, there isn't going to be any more to keep track of. The only question I want an answer to is, given that I'm standing on the surface, but my eyes are still closed, okay, what's the probability that when I open my eyes, I'm going to find that I'm wearing a green outfit, okay? And that's what I was having trouble making sense of, right?
Right, but I mean, I like that you formulate it as a puzzle about self-location,
Right.
not really identity.
Exactly,
Yeah.
right. I think that's the right way to formulate it. I agree.
Thanks, David.
Thanks, you.
We will take a 10-minute break and we will start at 2:15. I mean, one of the requirements of the soft meeting.
I'm aware that you would prefer to project from your computer. Is there any chance I could twist your arm? It's just with the Zoom setup, it would be.
I know.
Years ago.